After the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the following resolution that gave the president authorities to protect American interests abroad, within a few months, the United States began a little bit of more of an escalation after several other incidents had happened. The United States had a military installation at Pleiku in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam that had been attacked by communist forces. Shortly thereafter, by early 1965, the United States had a naval base at Da Nang in South Vietnam that had been attacked by the Viet Cong. Because there were no troops there to defend the American air base, American planes and other advisories were vulnerable to attack. So it was decided around that time that the United States would escalate our involvement there. And in March of 1965, two battalions of United States Marines were delivered at the beachhead off the shores of Da Nang to defend the American air base there at Da Nang. Things kind of securitized, but the communist guerrillas were still out there. Shortly there later, the order came for those Marines to actively search for the VC. And various amounts of minor engagements would happen. Some would be fruitless. But in the summer of 1965, the United States under Johnson decided to expand even further by sending even larger amounts of United States forces to search for and look for communist guerrillas. In November of 1965, the 7th Cavalry had been assigned to the Central Highlands in Vietnam. And their mission was to find communists, whether communist guerrillas or actual North Vietnamese regular army troops themselves, and kill as many of them as possible. See what's out there. See what you can find. And in a story widely publicized by the movie We Were Soldiers, based upon the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young, the 7th Cavalry encountered a very, very large North Vietnamese regular army force that had been hiding in the foothills of the Chupong Massif, near the coast, or I'm sorry, near the border. There, Laos and Cambodia, right and around there, just inside Vietnam. About 400 or so American troops would engage about 1,500 North Vietnamese regular army troops. These were not guerrilla fighters. These were North Vietnamese trained army troops. And over the course of the next few days, American forces with new techniques would engage the North Vietnamese army and have massive battles. And throughout the conflict, 79 Americans lost their lives. A couple hundred others were severely wounded. That also being said, over 1,200 North Vietnamese soldiers were killed. So as a result, at the battle at Ia Drang, which is that battle was called, that engagement at the Chupong Massif, Ia Drang basically told American commanders, what they took from it was, we had a major engagement with a major communist enemy. We killed far more of them than they killed of us. If we keep up this sort of tactic, this search and destroy type tactic, we are eventually going to be able to kill so many of them that they will not be able to replenish their supplies and personnel. Therefore, they're going to have to cry uncle, and this thing will be over before you know it. The United States decided, based upon our results at Ia Drang, to engage in a war of attrition. We're going to find them, we're going to kill them, and eventually there's not going to be any of them left. That was the philosophy at the time. So, unlike in World War II, where you have a Pacific theater where you're engaging the Japanese military, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Midway, you're making a a direct line towards Tokyo. You're in the European theater. You're you're invading the shores of Normandy. You're gonna eventually make your way and liberate Paris and make your way eventually to Berlin. There is a progression. You can gauge how well you're doing in the war because you have a specific objective that you can meet. Well, you took Midway, you just took Okinawa, you just took Iwo Jima, you just liberated Guadalcanal, you just liberated Paris. You're winning. In a war of attrition, how do you know you've won? How do you know that you've killed so many enemy combatants that they're not going to be able to supply themselves? What we also uncover was that those communist fighters, both regular army and guerrilla through the VC, they've got a plan of their own. They have a sophisticated network of tunnels underground that are virtually indiscoverable. They have a sophisticated network of roads and other pathways that go into Laos and Cambodia from northern parts of North Vietnam all the way down to the southernmost parts of South Vietnam and through the mountainside going into South Vietnam. And you can see an example of that, what I'm talking about, on slide 20. That network of sophisticated pathways from North Vietnam into Laos and Cambodia and eventually into South Vietnam would be known to Americans as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was a major artery and supply line for the communist war effort to supply the Viet Cong, to supply North Vietnamese troops, eventually invading South Vietnam. How do you know you've won? How do you know that you have inflicted enough damage in a war of attrition to defeat your enemy? Because it sure seemed like the North Vietnamese and VC guerrillas were producing far more combatants than we could kill. And the United States killed bushels, dozens, thousands, perhaps over 1 million communist combatants in Vietnam. We killed them by the numbers every day. The United States never lost a major battle of consequence in Vietnam. However, doesn't mean we won. The communist effort, it became readily obvious within a short amount of time that the communist effort would be willing to take mass casualties so as to eventually outlast the United States, disengage the American public from war interest, promote enough of an interest and movement against the war that eventually the United States would just up and leave. That was their strategy. They would be willing to take 10-to-1 casualty differences because that's basically what it was. We killed anywhere from 10 to 12 of them for every one American serviceman killed. You have over 38,000 United States Army soldiers killed, over 14,000 Marines, a number of Navy and Air Force pilots were shot down, other personnel. Over the course of the next 8 years, roughly about 58,000 American servicemen and women lost their lives as a result of a conflict in Vietnam. And the war of attrition had part to do with that. You didn't know who was who. And because the VC had a stranglehold on South Vietnamese society, they could blend in seamlessly. There could be advisors and people driving taxis, and maybe your bartender at the bar in Saigon might be a friendly guy and he serves you a drink. But in his spare time, he's a VC informant. And he's trying to get American troops drunk so that they can spill the beans, spill the tea, if you will. You have an intelligence issue because you don't know who's who. They have a sophisticated tunnel network, one of which at Cu Chi actually ran underneath an American air base there, an American military installation. They had tunnels underneath it. This is amazing. The commitment to the effort of unification was stronger than than our effort to prevent it. And we were committed. So think about that. Because many people could seamlessly blend into society, you had a war where the VC would not engage unless they could fight on their terms. They could hide underground, they could hide in trees, hide anywhere else they can, and engage American troops on their terms and initiate confrontations and contact because of that. That creates an issue, especially as you have American troops who are succumbing not only to guerrilla warfare, but also to booby traps, punji sticks, handmade weapons, pipe bombs. You uncover a village that has a bag of rice, and you open up the bag, and there's a pressure release bomb or some sort of grenade there. A lot of American troops lost their lives and lost other things like limbs and eyesight and all kinds of things because of these small little things that would mess with American troops' heads. And as an American troop, you don't always have a way of retaliating against somebody who does that to you or your buddy or people that you have known for a while. So you start to develop this sense of utter resentment because the people that you are there to protect aren't helping you, because they themselves fear the Viet Cong. They fear bitter communist reprisals should they aid the United States or South Vietnamese forces. Or maybe they're sympathetic to the VC. Maybe the VC is talking to a villager's mom so that her son could join the Viet Cong. Otherwise, the people that we're there to protect oftentimes become the point of ire for American servicemen. And you see events like the My Lai massacre, which in March 1968, American troops opened fire and murdered several hundred Vietnamese villagers at the village of My Lai in north central Vietnam. Largely done as a reprisal and outburst and psychological conflict, if you will, because these people were not helping the American side. They were either seen as being VC themselves or sympathizers of the VC. And when you have engaged in enough mental struggle, you're going to snap. American troops snapped at My Lai, and they killed a couple hundred villagers. It's a great stain in Vietnam. Otherwise, the United States would begin massive bombing campaigns, not only of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but of North Vietnam itself. A campaign to prevent the Vietnamese from resupplying and rearming. And it would be effective for a few days until they would rebuild. These are folks that are committed. The United States would also begin a different process. Instead of trying to take a village that had been sympathetic to the VC and burning it down, they would actually try and pacify the village by going into the village and actually providing modern medicine to villagers and people who had never seen anything like vaccines or anything else like that before. Immunizations, vaccines, the various different medicines that could now treat infections, that could be offered food that would provide better nutrition, anything else of the sort. The Americans began a pacification process for all of those different types of things. Okay. Meanwhile, the American public back home saw our escalation in Vietnam happen on a nightly basis. Vietnam was the first military conflict in which there were no media restrictions. You had oftentimes journalists attached to military units out there in the field. And they would report back American casualties every day. This would really weigh on the American psyche. And 1966 became a year of escalation. We went from having 16,000 advisors a few years beforehand to having over 180,000 American troops from the start of 1966 to almost 300,000 by the end of 1966. and it continues even there. As our involvement gets heavier and heavier, and as our demands need to be met further and further, and as the communist threat continues to build, not just with the VC, but with also the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, our commitment to winning it now must escalate even further to where, at one point, by mid 1969, the United States had 543,000 troops in Vietnam. 543,000. The most the United States ever had in Iraq was about 160,000 around 2007. We had a lot of servicemen and women in Iraq. That was only a fraction of what we had in Vietnam. Keep in mind, there are more people in the United States now than there were in the 1960s. Over 2.5 million people would serve in Vietnam over the course of the conflict. Okay? So keep that in mind. Meanwhile, the United States public back home would see daily reminders of our war efforts. They would see daily reminders of why all these things were going on, why our sons were being killed, why we're trying to contain communists, and why it's kind of a fruitless effort. There was a massive anti-war sentiment in the United States that revolved around the idea of wrongfully escalating war. And what are we getting for it? Why are we fighting? The American government said that we're fighting so that we could prevent communist takeovers in Southeast Asia. The United States feared a domino effect, as coined by Eisenhower back in the 50s, that if one country in Southeast Asia were to fall under communism, you would see others immediately follow suit. We were there to prevent communism from spreading. We were there to protect our South Vietnamese democratic ally from going by the way of communism. That's why we were there. Whether that's the right thing or not, that was the justification. And of course, under the Gulf of Tonkin, that's what was justified. They attacked us, so we escalated our involvement. Okay? Nevertheless, you have an anti-war sentiment that takes grip over the nation. You have a draft that is implemented so that if your number is called up, you could be forced into selective service and you'll be required to join the military. More specifically, either the Army or the Marine Corps. Okay? So, you have high school age young men, largely in this era, who immediately upon graduation are drafted into service. Congratulations, you just graduated high school. Now go to Fort Benning, show up for basic training, or go to Parris Island for your Marine Corps recruit boot camp. Okay, you'll stand on those yellow steps. Congratulations, you just graduated from boot camp or basic training. You're going to get some advanced training. Soon thereafter, you're going to be assigned to Vietnam. Congratulations. You might graduate high school at the end of May, and by November, you'll be in Vietnam. That was reality for thousands of young American men at that time. Okay? And many protesters would oftentimes burn their draft cards, crowd streets, and have reprisals that would sometimes get violent with their protesting and resentment. Vietnam, and we'll continue this conversation at a next stage, really divided our country. It became a true hotbed issue. We are sending young American men oftentimes to their deaths. And for what? And how are we doing it? Questions of leadership, questions of why we're there. And if we're there, why are we doing things this way? What results are we seeing from this? You have a quagmire that you're not seeing results from, and it's causing issue. We'll talk about one particular aspect of it here soon. We'll continue soon.